It's a fundamental truth I've learned over decades of helping people untangle their lives. Sometimes the most outlandish stories hold the deepest, most uncomfortable truths, and the biggest lie isn't the one someone tells you, but the one they tell themselves. When a 19-year-old girl walks onto my stage claiming she married a man she knew for 3 days and that no one, not her family, not her friends, not even the people around her, believed her, my antennae go up. It's a claim that screams either profound delusion or an even more profound cry for help, a cry for someone, anyone, to truly listen, to truly see beyond the headlines and the raised eyebrows. What brings someone to a place where they make such a decision? And then, more importantly, what keeps them trapped in the echo chamber of disbelief? This isn't just about a quick marriage. It's about the underlying architecture of a young woman's reality, a reality that had seemingly fractured so dramatically that she felt utterly isolated in her own truth. My job, as I see it, isn't just to sort out the facts of a situation, but to peel back the layers of denial, of pain, of misconception, and sometimes of outright manipulation to get to the core of what's really going on. I've seen enough to know that very rarely is anything as simple as it appears on the surface, and a story like hers, with its jarring details, practically demanded a deeper dive. The world had already slapped her with labels: impulsive, naive, perhaps even desperate. But those are just easy outs, convenient boxes we put people in when we don't want to do the hard work of understanding. My initial impression, before she even sat down, was less about judgment and more about a quiet, almost unsettling curiosity. What drove this particular narrative? What was the real story underneath the story everyone was so quick to dismiss? You see, when a person is screaming something so loud, so unconventional, and yet everyone around them is just shaking their heads, there's a disconnect. And that disconnect is precisely where the real work begins. Her name was Sarah, and she carried herself with a strange mix of defiance and fragility. She'd come to me because she felt invalidated, unseen, and unheard. Everyone had decided for her what her experience was, and none of it aligned with what she knew in her heart. That's a powerful, lonely place to be, especially for someone so young. The central problem, as she presented it, wasn't just the fact of her marriage, but the complete lack of validation she received from her family. They called it a hoax, a cry for attention, a foolish mistake. To them, she was a child playing grown-up games, making decisions she couldn't possibly comprehend the gravity of. But to Sarah, it was real. Her conviction, despite the skepticism, was palpable, and that's what truly caught my attention. Delusion usually wavers, crumbles under scrutiny. Her truth, however inconvenient or bizarre, held a certain steeliness. It made me wonder what kind of foundation had been laid in her life that such a radical act and subsequent dismissal could become her reality. You don't just wake up one day and decide to marry a stranger after 72 hours without a lifetime of experiences shaping that decision. This kind of impulsivity, this desperate grab for something, anything, often stems from a deep well of unmet needs. What I looked for right away was the pattern. Was this a sudden, isolated incident, or was it the latest, most dramatic manifestation of a long-standing behavioral or emotional blueprint? My gut told me it was the latter. I started digging into her backstory, not just the 3 days leading up to the marriage, but the years before. What was her family dynamic like? What kind of relationships had she witnessed, both healthy and unhealthy? Had she felt seen, heard, and valued growing up? Often, when someone makes such a radical departure from societal norms, it's because they're unconsciously trying to fill a void or rewrite a narrative that has been playing out in their lives for a very long time. Sarah spoke of a childhood where she often felt overlooked, a middle child perhaps, striving for attention in ways that were increasingly dramatic. She described a home life that, while not overtly abusive, was emotionally distant. Her parents, good people by most measures, were busy, preoccupied, and perhaps not equipped to truly engage with the emotional landscape of a sensitive young girl. She learned early on that to be noticed, she had to be loud, she had to be different, she had to be problematic. This wasn't a conscious strategy, but a subconscious survival mechanism. The labels others placed on her, dramatic, attention-seeking, were in a twisted way an affirmation that she existed, that she could elicit a reaction, and in the vacuum of genuine emotional connection, any reaction, even negative, can feel like a form of validation. This is where the seed of her vulnerability was planted, making her susceptible to intense, whirlwind experiences that promised immediate, profound connection, however fleeting or superficial. She was chasing an emotional high, a feeling of being absolutely, utterly central to someone's world, a feeling she had rarely, if ever, experienced in her formative years. The man she married, a charismatic figure she met online, offered her exactly that. He mirrored her desires, amplified her dreams, and in those 3 whirlwind days, created an illusion of intimacy and understanding that she had been starved of her entire life. He told her she was special, that he saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. For a young woman desperately seeking validation, these words were like water in a desert. They bypassed all logical defenses, all rational caution. She wasn't looking for a husband, she was looking for a witness. Someone to confirm her existence, someone to validate her feelings and her choices no matter how extreme. The marriage itself, in her mind, wasn't just a union with a man, but a declaration of her own agency, a radical act of self-definition in the face of years of feeling invisible. When her family reacted with outright dismissal, it wasn't just them questioning her marriage, it was them, in her eyes, once again questioning her, her judgment, her very being. This, for Sarah, was the ultimate betrayal. It solidified her conviction that she was alone in her truth and that no one would ever truly understand her or believe her. When Sarah finally revealed her marriage to her family, the reaction was exactly what you'd expect, and yet for her, it felt like a fresh wound. It wasn't just surprise or concern, it was outright disbelief laced with a kind of patronizing exasperation. Her parents, confronted with this bombshell, immediately moved into damage control, but their approach was less about understanding and more about containment. They saw a problem to be fixed, a public embarrassment to be managed, not a daughter in distress. This is where the escalation truly began. Not with the act itself, but with the clashing realities of a young woman and her family. Her mother, she told me, immediately accused her of making it all up for attention. "Sarah, you're not serious. This is just another one of your dramas," was the alleged response. Her father, typically more reserved, couldn't even look her in the eye, shaking his head and muttering about consequences and poor judgment. For Sarah, this wasn't just them denying her marriage, it was them denying her entire experience, her identity, and in a twisted way, dismissing her very existence once more. It was a replay of a childhood pattern, but amplified to an unbearable degree. The feeling of being unheard, of being labeled as dramatic or attention-seeking, was now validated by her most significant life event. And that's a dangerous place for a young person's psyche to be. The dynamic quickly devolved into a classic blame game. From the family's perspective, Sarah was entirely at fault. She had acted impulsively, recklessly, and without any consideration for their feelings or the family's reputation. They couldn't fathom how she could make such a monumental decision in 3 days, and their inability to comprehend it led them to conclude it must be either a lie or a severe lapse in judgment on her part. They started digging, not to understand her feelings, but to find evidence that the marriage wasn't real or that the man was a fraud. They wanted proof to support their narrative that she was either deceived or delusional. This search for external validation of their own disbelief only served to further alienate Sarah. Sarah, on the other hand, saw herself as the victim of their misunderstanding. She felt they were refusing to acknowledge her growth, her right to make her own choices, and the depth of the connection she believed she had found. She blamed them for not seeing her, for always reducing her to a caricature of her past self. They never believed I could do anything right, she'd tell me, her voice tinged with bitterness. They just wanted me to be the little girl they could control. When I did something they couldn't control, they just said it wasn't real. This wasn't just about a marriage anymore. It was about a lifetime of unresolved emotional conflict, a battle for autonomy and recognition that had finally reached its boiling point. The daily interactions became landmines. Every conversation was an argument waiting to happen. If Sarah brought up her husband, her family would either scoff, change the subject, or launch into another lecture about her naivete. If they tried to talk about her future, she would retort, "My future is with my husband," further cementing their belief that she was lost in a fantasy. The emotional temperature in the house was constantly elevated, a simmering pot of resentment and frustration. There was no common ground, no willingness from either side to truly step into the other's shoes. The lines of communication were not just breaking down, they were being actively severed by layers of anger and hurt. What often happens in these situations is that the emotional stakes get so high that people become entrenched in their positions. They're no longer arguing about the facts, they're arguing about who gets to define reality. For Sarah, her reality was that she was married. For her family, their reality was that she was either mistaken or manipulative. Neither side could afford to concede, because to do so would mean admitting they were wrong about something fundamental, something deeply tied to their perception of themselves and each other. This kind of stalemate is emotionally exhausting and psychologically damaging, especially for a young person whose sense of self is still forming. The tension became unbearable. Sarah felt suffocated, her home becoming a battleground where she constantly had to defend her choices and her identity. Her family felt increasingly helpless and worried, seeing their daughter slipping further into what they perceived as a delusion. They were desperate to pull her back, but every attempt only pushed her further away. It was a vicious cycle. Their efforts to help her by invalidating her experience only made her cling tighter to that experience as a defiance, as a way to assert her independence and prove them wrong. The ultimate escalation came when Sarah, feeling completely cornered and misunderstood, decided she needed an external arbiter. She needed someone with authority, someone who wasn't emotionally invested in the family dynamic, to look at her situation with an objective eye. She believed that if she could just get her story out, if she could just tell someone who wasn't her parent or sibling, then maybe, just maybe, someone would believe her. She saw my show as her last resort, a public forum where her truth could finally be heard and perhaps validated. She wasn't necessarily seeking reconciliation with her family at that point. She was seeking vindication. She wanted someone to say, "Yes, Sarah, this is real. You are not crazy." She came to me not just with a problem, but with a plea. Tell me I'm not making this up. Tell them I'm not making this up. That's a heavy burden to carry, and it set the stage for one of the most complex confrontations I've ever had to navigate. When Sarah sat across from me on the stage, the tension in the studio was palpable. Her family was there too, seated in the audience, their faces a mixture of concern, frustration, and what appeared to be outright skepticism. This wasn't just a young woman seeking validation. It was a powder keg of family dynamics ready to explode. My role in these situations is often to be the catalyst, to push through the noise and get to the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. And with Sarah, it was clear that the discomfort ran deep. I started by letting her tell her story uninterrupted. I wanted to hear it in her own words, without the filters of family opinion or media sensationalism. She recounted meeting him online, the intense connection she felt, the 3 days of what she described as magical, profound understanding. She spoke of the elopement, the simple ceremony, the absolute conviction that this was real, that this was love, and that he truly saw her. Her voice wavered at times, but her conviction never did. That unwavering certainty, despite the absurdity of the timeline, was telling. It wasn't the certainty of someone who's delusional. It was the certainty of someone who has clung to a belief so fiercely it's become their life raft. Then came the questions, the direct confrontation I'm known for. I looked her straight in the eye, cutting through the performative aspect of being on television. "Sarah," I asked, my voice calm but firm, "are you genuinely telling me that in 3 days you knew this man well enough to commit your entire life to him? Forget what your family thinks for a moment. Forget what the world says. In your heart of hearts, do you truly understand the gravity of that decision, and are you certain you've done your due diligence?" She paused, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of doubt, a shadow of the girl underneath the defensive armor, but it quickly vanished. "Yes, doctor." "Phil?" she insisted, her chin rising slightly. "I know it sounds crazy, but when you know, you know. He made me feel seen, like I finally belonged. No one has ever made me feel that way before." That last part was the key. No one has ever made me feel that way before. That was the crack in the facade, the opening I needed. I then turned to her family, specifically her mother, who was visibly agitated. "Ma'am," I addressed her, "your daughter just said something very profound. She said no one has ever made her feel seen or belong before. How does that resonate with you as her mother?" Her mother, initially defensive, sputtered, "That's ridiculous. We love her. We've always loved her. We just want her to be safe, to make good choices." But her eyes, though, shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't ready to truly hear it. This is where the psychological unraveling began. I didn't attack Sarah's marriage directly. Instead, I shifted the focus to the why. Sarah continued, "What does feeling seen mean to you? What did he do or say in those 3 days that was so profoundly different from anything you've experienced with your family?" She described a level of intense, focused attention she had never received. He listened without judgment. He praised her unique qualities. He made her feel like the most important person in the world. He understood her quirks, her dreams, her insecurities. He essentially mirrored back to her the idealized version of herself she longed to be, and in her desperate need for validation, she latched onto it. I then gently but firmly challenged her on the difference between infatuation and true intimacy. "Sarah," I explained, "when someone tells you everything you want to hear, when they shower you with attention and make you feel incredible, that's a powerful drug, especially if you've been starved of that kind of emotional nourishment your whole life. But that's not necessarily love. That's often a projection of your own desires onto someone else. And the scary thing is, a skilled manipulator knows exactly how to tap into those unmet needs and exploit them." Her resistance was strong. She fought back. defending her husband, describing his genuine nature, his kindness. She truly believed in him and in their connection. It wasn't a conscious lie. It was her truth, painstakingly constructed from her own emotional landscape. But the seeds of doubt, however small, were beginning to sprout. My questions weren't about proving her wrong, but about making her think, making her question the foundation of her belief and confront the underlying vulnerabilities that made her so susceptible. I showed her examples of how people, particularly young people, can be swept up in a whirlwind romance that is more about their own emotional needs than a genuine connection with another person. I didn't call her naive, but I laid out the psychological framework of why someone in her position might make such a decision and why it might feel so overwhelmingly real to them, even if it appears irrational to everyone else. The point was to provide her with a lens to understand her own behavior, not to shame her for it. The breakthrough moment, if you can call it that, wasn't a sudden burst of tears or an admission of error. It was a subtle shift in her body language. Her shoulders, which had been defensively hunched, relaxed slightly. Her gaze, which had been fixed and defiant, softened. She was still defending her marriage, but she was starting to listen to the psychological analysis, starting to consider the possibility that her intense feelings, however real, might have a different origin than she had previously believed. She was beginning to consider the narrative that her unmet needs had made her vulnerable. I then turned back to her family, and this was crucial. You want your daughter to be safe, I stated to her mother. You want her to make good choices. But do you understand that by constantly dismissing her, by calling her dramatic, by refusing to validate her feelings, however misguided you believe her actions to be, you are pushing her further into the arms of the very thing you fear? You are inadvertently confirming her belief that she is alone and that this man is the only one who truly sees her. That hit home. Her mother's face crumpled. It wasn't an admission that Sarah was right, but it was an acknowledgement of their part in the dynamic, an understanding that their well-intentioned concerns had been delivered in a way that fueled the very behavior they wanted to stop. This was the opening for healing, not just for Sarah, but for the entire family unit. The confrontation wasn't just with Sarah, it was with the systemic patterns that had led them all to this dramatic precipice. It was about dismantling the blame and starting to build bridges of understanding. The confrontation on stage had been a turning point, not in the sense of a grand, dramatic confession, but in a far more subtle, yet profound way. Sarah hadn't suddenly declared her marriage a sham, nor had her family immediately embraced her husband as their new son-in-law. Instead, what shifted was the narrative, and more importantly, the perspective through which everyone was viewing the situation. I had introduced the concept that her perceived impulsivity wasn't random, but a pattern rooted in unmet emotional needs, and that her family's disbelief, while understandable, was exacerbating the problem. In the days and weeks that followed the taping, I continued to work with Sarah and her family, both individually and collectively. The immediate outcome wasn't a resolution of the marriage itself, but a resolution of the communication breakdown. For Sarah, the initial shock of having her motivations analyzed rather than just her actions judged started to sink in. She began to see that her intense connection to this man might have been amplified by a lifetime of feeling overlooked. This wasn't to say her feelings weren't real, but that their intensity and the speed at which they developed were highly influenced by her psychological landscape. We worked on helping her differentiate between genuine intimacy and the intoxicating thrill of being idealized. I asked her to truly evaluate what she knew about this man beyond the surface-level affirmations. What were his long-term goals? What were his flaws? What did she know about his past relationships, his family, his daily life. When you're caught in a whirlwind romance fueled by emotional deprivation, you often fill in the blanks with your own fantasies. My goal was to equip her with the tools to critically assess the relationship, not to tell her what to do. The decision had to be hers, but it needed to be an informed one, built on reality, not just desire. For her family, particularly her mother, the revelation about Sarah's unmet needs was a painful but necessary truth. It wasn't about excusing Sarah's choices, but about understanding the why. They started to acknowledge that while they loved her, they might have unintentionally created an environment where she felt she needed to take drastic measures to be seen. This was a crucial shift. Instead of solely blaming Sarah, they began to consider their own role in the dynamic. This allowed them to approach Sarah not just with concern, but with a newfound empathy. They started listening, truly listening, without immediately jumping to judgment or trying to fix her. This change in family dynamic was perhaps the most significant immediate outcome. The constant bickering subsided, replaced by cautious, sometimes awkward, but genuine conversations. They began to rebuild trust, not by agreeing on the marriage, but by agreeing to respect each other's feelings and perspectives. Sarah started to feel less isolated, less like she had to defend herself against an entire world that believed she was wrong. This validation, coming from her family, even if it wasn't about the marriage directly, was a powerful antidote to the isolation she had felt. It gave her the emotional support she needed to begin to think more clearly, to question, and to process. As for the marriage itself, the outcome was, as often happens in real life, a complex unfolding. With the support of her family and with the psychological tools I had provided, Sarah started to ask harder questions of her husband. She began to look past the charming affirmations and into the substance of their connection. What she found, as many do in such situations, was that the intensity of those initial 3 days didn't translate into a sustainable, deep partnership. The man, once confronted with Sarah's newfound critical thinking and the involvement of her family, slowly began to retreat. He wasn't overtly malicious. He was simply someone who thrived on the immediate, intense, emotional connection and wasn't equipped or willing to build a relationship grounded in the less glamorous, more challenging realities of everyday life. It wasn't an explosive breakup, but a gradual realization for Sarah that what she had perceived as profound intimacy was in fact a carefully constructed facade that catered to her deepest needs but lacked true reciprocal depth. She didn't feel angry or betrayed as much as she felt a quiet, profound sadness. Sadness for the illusion and sadness for the part of herself that had been so desperate to believe it. Ultimately, Sarah made the difficult decision to dissolve the marriage. It wasn't a defeat, it was a testament to her growth. She realized that she deserved a relationship built on something more substantial than a mutual escape from loneliness or a desperate need for validation. This wasn't a happily ever after ending in the traditional sense, but it was an immensely real and deeply personal triumph. She had learned to distinguish between true connection and psychological mirroring, between genuine love and an urgent need to be seen. The family, while relieved, didn't gloat. They understood that this was Sarah's journey and her learning experience. Their focus shifted from critiquing her past decision to supporting her future growth. The healing of their own communication patterns became a continuous process, something they consciously worked on. Sarah continued to work on understanding her own emotional vulnerabilities and building a stronger sense of self independent of external validation. This case, like so many others, underscored a critical truth. We often project our deepest needs and desires onto others, especially when those needs have gone unmet. And sometimes the most dramatic actions are simply the loudest cries for help. Sarah's journey wasn't about whether her marriage was real in the legal sense, but whether she could finally understand the truth of her own heart, navigate the complexities of her family dynamics, and, perhaps most importantly, learn to truly see and validate herself. That, to me, is the real measure of growth and change. It was a messy human story, devoid of the neat resolutions you often see on TV, but profoundly authentic in its unfolding. And that's the kind of truth that truly matters. The journey with Sarah and her family was a poignant reminder that people often come to me not just with a problem, but with an entire system of dysfunction, misunderstandings, and unspoken hurts that have festered over years. Her marriage, however unconventional, was merely the dramatic tip of an iceberg, a symptom of deeper psychological currents at play. What I witnessed and helped facilitate was a transformation not just of a single individual, but of an entire family unit beginning to heal its underlying fractures. The initial relief within the family after Sarah decided to end her marriage was palpable, but it was quickly tempered by a more mature understanding. They had, through our sessions, come to grips with the idea that simply being right about the marriage wasn't the goal. The true victory wasn't her leaving him, it was her understanding why she had entered into such a situation in the first place, and her family understanding their role in that initial susceptibility. This level of insight prevents future recurrences, breaks patterns, and fosters genuine growth. It moves beyond the immediate crisis to address the root causes. Sarah's path post-separation was not linear, as few healing journeys ever are. There were moments of doubt, moments of loneliness, and the natural human tendency to question whether she had made the right choice. She had invested so much emotional energy into that relationship, however brief, that disentangling herself from its narrative was a monumental task. I continued to emphasize the importance of building her own internal resources for validation rather than constantly seeking them from external sources. We worked on strengthening her self-esteem, on identifying her true passions and interests, and on developing healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with feelings of inadequacy or loneliness. This was about shifting her locus of control from external approval to internal self-worth. She began to engage in activities she genuinely enjoyed, not to impress anyone, but for her own fulfillment. She reconnected with old friends, but this time the interactions were more authentic, less about performing for attention and more about genuine connection. She started to seek out relationships, both platonic and romantic, that were built on mutual respect and genuine understanding, rather than intense, superficial flattery. This was a critical step in breaking the pattern of seeking out partners who would simply mirror her desires, and instead looking for those who would challenge her to grow in a healthy, supportive way. Her family, for their part, continued their own work. The conversations that had started on my stage deepened. Her parents, especially her mother, made a conscious effort to listen to Sarah without judgment, to ask open-ended questions, and to validate her feelings even when they didn't fully agree with her perspective. This wasn't easy. It required them to unlearn years of ingrained habits and communication styles. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns would resurface, but they were now equipped with the awareness to recognize them and the commitment to course correct. They learned that expressing concern didn't have to mean invalidating her experience. It could mean saying, "Sarah, I hear that you're hurting, and I want to understand what you're feeling, even if I don't fully grasp your choices." That distinction was paramount. The shift in their family dynamic had a ripple effect beyond Sarah. Her siblings, who had also been caught in the crossfire of the conflict, began to experience a more open and honest communication within the household. It wasn't about perfection, but about progress, the slow, steady work of building healthier relationships brick by painful brick. Looking back, Sarah's outcome wasn't a dramatic Hollywood ending where she found her soulmate in a subsequent whirlwind romance. It was far more real, far more impactful. She didn't instantly transform into a completely different person, but she had gained profound self-awareness. She understood the intricate interplay of her past experiences, her emotional needs, and her decision-making process. She had faced the uncomfortable truth about her vulnerabilities and had begun the lifelong work of fortifying them. She was, in essence, learning to become her own most reliable source of validation. The final piece of this puzzle for Sarah was truly forgiving herself. She had carried a heavy burden of shame and regret, not just from the marriage itself, but from the public spectacle of it all. I helped her understand that self-forgiveness isn't about condoning past mistakes, but about accepting them as part of her journey and learning from them. It's about letting go of the self-recrimination that traps you in the past and frees you to move forward. She began to see her experience not as a failure, but as a crucible that forged a stronger, more resilient, and more self-aware individual. This case was a testament to the power of genuine listening, of peeling back layers, and of the human capacity for growth, even in the face of profound personal and familial conflict. Sarah's story became a powerful example for other young people and for parents, demonstrating that beneath the most perplexing behaviors often lies a deep longing for connection and understanding. It showed that change isn't always about a complete overhaul, but about subtle, sustained shifts in perspective, communication, and self-awareness. And that, in my line of work, is the most rewarding outcome of all. The ripple effects of Sarah's story continued to unfold long after she left my stage. It's a testament to the fact that therapy, true psychological work, isn't a one-time event, but an ongoing process of self-discovery and relational adjustment. While we had made significant breakthroughs during her time on the show and in the follow-up sessions, the true test of enduring change comes when people return to their everyday lives and face the ongoing challenges without direct intervention. For Sarah, the experience had been a powerful mirror. She had seen herself reflected through my analysis, through her family's reactions, and most importantly, through her own growing self-awareness. The initial intense need for external validation, which had driven her into the arms of a man she barely knew, slowly began to recede. She learned that while it's natural to want to feel seen and loved by others, her primary source of self-worth had to come from within. This realization wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a gradual, sometimes frustrating journey of internalizing new beliefs and practicing new behaviors. One of the most profound changes I observed in Sarah was her approach to relationships. Previously, she would dive headfirst into intense connections, mistaking immediate chemistry for lasting compatibility. Now, she became more discerning. She learned to slow down, to observe, to ask more probing questions, and to truly assess whether a potential partner was engaging with her authentic self or simply reflecting back what she wanted to hear. She started prioritizing depth and genuine connection over superficial intensity. This wasn't about becoming cynical or closed off, but about becoming wise and self-protective. She understood that a truly healthy relationship doesn't demand you to give up your identity, but enhances it. Her academic and career pursuits also gained a new sense of direction. Without the constant emotional turmoil surrounding her personal life, she was able to focus her energy on her studies and explore potential career paths that genuinely interested her rather than those she felt would impress others. She began to derive satisfaction from her achievements, not because they brought external praise, but because they represented her own effort and growth. This shift from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation was a huge leap for someone who had so long sought validation from the outside. The family dynamics continued to evolve positively as well. It wasn't perfect, of course. Families are complex ecosystems, and old habits die hard. There were still moments of tension, miscommunication, and the occasional relapse into old patterns. However, what was different was their newfound ability to address these issues head on, with greater empathy and a shared understanding of their individual roles in the dynamic. They had learned to apologize more readily, to actively listen, and to give each other the benefit of the doubt. Sarah's parents, in particular, became more intentional about nurturing open communication, recognizing that their daughter's earlier dramatic behaviors were a cry for the very connection they now work so hard to provide. They realized that their love for her was never in doubt, but their expression of that love sometimes needed an overhaul. What Sarah taught me, and what I hope her story conveyed to others, is that truth is often multifaceted, and judgment rarely serves understanding. When someone presents an extreme situation, it's rarely about the extreme action itself. It's about the internal landscape that led to it. My role was not to tell Sarah she was wrong, but to help her see why she felt she needed to be right in such a dramatic fashion, and to equip her with the tools to build a life grounded in authenticity and self-respect. Her journey wasn't a fairy tale ending, nor was it a cautionary tale of utter ruin. It was a profoundly human story of a young woman who, through a series of dramatic events and a willingness to look inward, discovered her own strength and began to forge a path built on genuine self-awareness and healthier relationships. She didn't just survive her experience, she grew from it. She learned that believing in herself, truly believing and validating her own feelings and worth was the most important marriage she would ever enter into. And in the often chaotic, truth-bending world of human emotions, that is a victory worth celebrating, a quiet triumph that speaks volumes about the human spirit's capacity for resilience and change. Her initial cry for someone to believe her transformed into a quiet confidence where she no longer needed external validation to confirm her reality. She learned to believe herself. And that, in the truest sense, is the ultimate outcome.